It was a bright Tuesday morning in Greenwich, Connecticut, and the sun cast long golden rays across the manicured lawn of the Ashford estate. Victoria Ashford stood on the stone patio in front of her $12 million mansion, her black designer dress catching the light as she greeted a group of businessmen in tailored suits. They had come to discuss a partnership, but one of them, Jonathan Prescott, had other intentions. He knelt slightly toward the little girl standing beside Victoria and smiled. "Would you like me to be your new daddy?" he asked. Sophie Ashford, 7 years old, did not answer. Her eyes drifted past the row of executives to a man standing near the hedgerow. He wore blue overalls and yellow rubber gloves, pushing a cleaning cart across the driveway. Sophie raised her arm and pointed directly at him. "I want him to be my daddy," she said clearly. The businessman froze. Victoria's face drained of color. Marcus Cole looked up from his work, stunned, staring down at the yellow gloves on his hands. 2 months before that morning, Victoria Ashford sat alone in a private office at Hartford General Hospital, staring at an MRI scan illuminated on the wall. The neurosurgeon across the desk spoke in measured tones, explaining that the growth in her brain was benign but positioned dangerously close to critical tissue. Surgery was necessary, he said, and while the procedure had a strong success rate, there remained a 12% chance of serious complications. He recommended she make arrangements for her daughter, just in case. Victoria asked what that meant, and the doctor removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said simply that she should ensure someone would be there for Sophie if the worst happened. Victoria drove home in silence, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The highway stretched before her like a gray ribbon, but she barely registered the other cars or the exit signs flashing past. She was not afraid of dying. She had faced worse fears in her 36 years. What terrified her was the thought of Sophie growing up alone, unprotected, forgotten by the world. Victoria knew that fear intimately because she had lived it. Her own mother had abandoned her at 6 years old, leaving her with a distant relative in a cramped apartment in Newark who treated her like a burden rather than a child. She remembered the nights she cried herself to sleep, the birthday parties she was never given, the school events where she sat alone because no one came to watch. She had clawed her way out of that life through sheer determination and ruthless ambition. She earned a scholarship to Yale, graduated top of her class, and built a real estate empire worth over $2 billion before she turned 35. She married a man named Richard Ashford, who loved her for who she was, not for what she had become. Together they created the family Victoria never had. Then Richard's private plane went down over the Atlantic 4 years ago during a business trip to London, and Victoria became a single mother overnight. The grief nearly destroyed her. Only Sophie kept her anchored to the world. Now, facing the possibility of leaving Sophie behind, Victoria did what she always did when confronted with a problem. She made a plan. She sat in her home office that night, the lamp casting a warm circle of light across her mahogany desk, and opened a leather notebook. She began writing a list of potential candidates who could become Sophie's stepfather. The criteria were precise. Wealth sufficient to protect Sophie from ever experiencing poverty, social standing to open doors, business acumen to manage the Ashford estate if necessary, and availability. She was not looking for love. Love was a luxury she could not afford to consider. She was looking for security, for a guarantee that Sophie would never feel the abandonment that had shaped Victoria's own childhood. Jonathan Prescott emerged at the top of the list. He was 42, the founder of a tech company valued at $3 billion, recently divorced with no children from that marriage, and already a business associate through various real estate and technology partnerships. He was handsome in a polished, magazine cover way, charming when he wanted to be, and had expressed interest in Victoria on multiple occasions. She had deflected his advances before, but now she reconsidered. She began inviting him to dinners and charity events, watching carefully how he behaved around Sophie, taking mental notes on every interaction. One evening, after Jonathan left, his cologne still lingering in the foyer, Sophie wandered into her mother's study. Victoria was reviewing documents related to the upcoming surgery, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sophie climbed onto the leather chair across from the desk, her small legs dangling above the floor. She asked why so many men in suits had been visiting lately, why they always brought flowers or wine, why they smiled at her with too many teeth. Victoria looked up from her papers, forced a smile that did not reach her eyes, and explained that they were friends. "Grown-ups needed friends," she said, "especially when times were difficult." Sophie nodded slowly, accepting the explanation without fully believing it. She glanced out the window where Marcus Cole was trimming the hedges in the fading daylight, his movements steady and methodical. "I need a friend too," Sophie whispered, more to herself than to her mother. Victoria did not hear her. She was already back to reading the surgical consent forms. 3 weeks before Sophie pointed at Marcus Cole in front of the businessmen, she sat alone on the back steps of the mansion, crying. The October sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, but Sophie noticed none of it. She had been walking past her mother's bedroom when she overheard a phone conversation that stopped her cold. Victoria was talking to her lawyer about finding someone suitable to take over parental responsibilities and ensuring Sophie has a father figure in place before the procedure. The words felt cold and clinical, like Sophie was a line item in a contract rather than a daughter to be loved. She ran outside, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she needed to escape the house that suddenly felt like a prison. She did not know how long she sat on the cold stone steps before she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Marcus Cole appeared around the corner, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with gardening tools. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of honest work. He wore his usual blue overalls and yellow rubber gloves, a pair of pruning shears tucked into his back pocket. He noticed the little girl immediately, saw the tears glistening on her cheeks, heard the small hiccuping sobs she was trying to suppress. But he did not rush over or ask what was wrong or try to fix anything. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for a hurting child was simply to be present without demanding anything in return. Instead, he sat down on a stone bench a few feet away from Sophie and began wiping dirt from a small trowel, humming softly to himself. He did not look at her directly, giving her space to compose herself or fall apart, whichever she needed. The only sound was the rasp of the cloth against metal and the distant chirping of crickets beginning their evening chorus. After several minutes of silence, Marcus spoke without looking up from his work. He mentioned casually that he was replanting some rose bushes that had died over the winter, victims of an unexpected late frost that had swept through Connecticut in March. The roots were still good, he explained, but they needed new soil and a better location with more morning sunlight. He wondered aloud if anyone might want to help him with the project. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, curiosity flickering through her sadness like a small flame. She stood up slowly, her movements hesitant, and walked over to where Marcus was working. He handed her a pair of child-sized gardening gloves, pink with white polka dots, that he kept in his wheelbarrow for exactly these moments. He showed her how to loosen the soil around the roots without damaging them, how to position the plant so it would get enough sunlight but not too much afternoon heat, how to pack the earth firmly but gently so the roots could breathe. His instructions were patient and clear, never condescending, treating her like a capable helper rather than a child who needed to be managed. While they worked side by side in the fading light, Sophie began to talk. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out of her like water breaking through a dam. She told Marcus that her mother wanted to find her a new father, but she did not want a new father. Her real father was gone, had been gone for 4 years now, and no one could replace him. She still remembered his laugh, the way he called her his little princess, the bedtime stories he made up just for her about a brave girl who saved kingdoms with her kindness. How could anyone replace that? How could her mother think a stranger in a suit could fill that space in her heart? Marcus stopped digging. He set down his trowel and looked at Sophie with an expression she could not quite read, something between understanding and sorrow. "My son Noah doesn't have a mother anymore," he said quietly. "His mom passed away 3 years ago when he was just a little guy. Sometimes, grown-ups think they know what's best for kids. They make plans and decisions because they're scared and they want to protect the people they love. But sometimes, they forget to ask how the other person feels about those plans. They forget that kids have hearts and opinions too." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but curious. "Are you sad too?" she asked. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Every single day," he admitted. "Some days are harder than others. But I have Noah, and he needs me to keep going. And now," he said, his voice lightening, "I have a new friend who helps me plant roses." For the first time in weeks, Sophie smiled. It was a small smile, fragile and uncertain, but it was real. A few minutes later, a 6-year-old boy came running around the corner of the mansion, calling for his dad. Noah Cole had sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed grin. He stopped short when he saw Sophie, suddenly shy. Sophie waved at him tentatively. Noah waved back. Within moments, the two children were chasing each other around the garden while Marcus watched, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. 2 weeks later, Victoria invited Jonathan Prescott to the mansion for lunch. She had arranged for Sophie to join them at the table, hoping that repeated exposure would help her daughter warm up to the man Victoria had identified as the most logical choice for their future. The dining room was set with the finest china, fresh flowers from the garden arranged in crystal vases, soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Everything was calculated to create an atmosphere of elegance and comfort. Jonathan arrived in a silver Porsche Cayenne, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile perfectly practiced. He brought a gift for Sophie, an iPad Pro loaded with the latest games and educational apps, wrapped in expensive paper with a silk ribbon. It was the kind of gift designed to impress adults rather than delight children, a display of wealth rather than thoughtfulness. Sophie accepted the gift politely, her small hands carefully removing the ribbon as her mother had taught her. She said thank you in the formal voice she used with strangers, then set the unopened box aside on a nearby chair. Jonathan's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, but he recovered quickly, settling into his seat at the table. Throughout the meal, Jonathan tried to engage Sophie in conversation. He asked about school, about her favorite subjects, about what she wanted to be when she grew up, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone, which he had placed face up beside his plate. Every notification made his gaze flicker downward. Every few minutes, he glanced at his platinum Rolex, calculating how much time remained before he could politely excuse himself for his next appointment. When Sophie mentioned, her voice brightening with genuine enthusiasm, that she had been helping plant roses in the garden, Jonathan said, "That's nice," without looking up from the notification he was reading. He immediately turned to ask Victoria about a commercial development project in Hartford, discussing square footage and profit margins, while Sophie sat forgotten between them. Midway through the main course, Sophie reached for her glass of lemonade and knocked it over. The liquid spread across the white linen tablecloth in a pale yellow stain, some of it splashing onto Jonathan's suit trousers. He jumped up from his chair, his face tightening with poorly concealed irritation. His jaw clenched, and for just a moment, something cold flashed in his eyes before he caught himself. It's fine," he said through a smile that did not reach his eyes. "These pants only cost $3,000. He laughed as if it were a joke, but there was an edge beneath the humor that made Sophie shrink in her chair. Victoria quickly intervened, calling for the housekeeper to clean up the spill, assuring Jonathan that accidents happened with children, that dry cleaning would take care of everything. She shot Sophie a look that conveyed both sympathy and a warning to be more careful. The rest of the meal passed in awkward conversation, with Sophie barely touching her food. After lunch, as Jonathan's silver car disappeared down the long driveway, Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. Victoria looked down at her daughter, expecting an apology for the spilled drink. Instead, Sophie said, "Mommy, Mr. Jonathan doesn't like me." Victoria knelt down, genuine confusion in her eyes. "Why would you say that, sweetheart? He bought you that beautiful iPad. That was very generous of him." Sophie shook her head slowly, her expression serious beyond her years. "He looked at his watch 11 times during lunch. I counted every single one." That same afternoon, while Victoria was on a conference call with her lawyers, Sophie slipped out to the garden where Marcus was raking fallen leaves into neat piles. She ran up to him, excitement breaking through her usual reserve, her earlier sadness temporarily forgotten. "Mr. Marcus, the roses we planted are blooming. You have to come see." Marcus set down his rake immediately, not bothering to finish the pile he had been working on. He followed Sophie across the lawn to the flower bed they had prepared together 3 weeks earlier. The bushes were covered in pale pink blossoms, delicate and fragrant, their petals catching the afternoon light. He crouched beside Sophie and examined the flowers with genuine appreciation. "These are beautiful," he said. "You took really good care of them. You watered them just right, not too much and not too little. That's hard to get right. Your father," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "would be very proud of the person you're becoming." Sophie's smile faltered at the mention of her father. "My daddy's gone," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been gone for a long time." Marcus lowered himself so his eyes were level with hers, his knees pressing into the soft earth. "I know," he said gently, "and I also know that people we love never really leave us. They stay in our hearts, and they watch over us from wherever they are. I think your daddy sees everything good you do. I think he's proud of you every single day." Something broke inside Sophie at those words. All the emotions she had been holding back, all the grief and loneliness and confusion, came rushing to the surface. She threw her arms around Marcus and buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing with the raw intensity that only children can produce. Marcus held very still, letting her cry, one hand resting lightly on her back. He did not try to stop her tears or offer hollow comfort or change the subject. He just let her feel what she needed to feel, present and patient and solid as a rock in a storm. Eleanor Ashford arrived at the mansion on a crisp autumn afternoon, her silver hair pinned elegantly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She was 68 years old, the mother of Victoria's late husband Richard, and the only member of the Ashford family who maintained a genuine relationship with her daughter-in-law. The other Ashfords had retreated into their grief after Richard's death, some blaming Victoria for encouraging his frequent business travel, others simply unable to face the reminder of their loss. But Eleanor understood that grief was not improved by isolation. She had raised 3 sons and buried 1, and she possessed the quiet wisdom that came from surviving both extraordinary joy and devastating sorrow. She found Sophie in the garden, laughing with unguarded delight as she helped a man in blue overalls identify different types of beetles on the underside of leaves. Eleanor watched from the terrace, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The man spoke to Sophie with patience and warmth, crouching beside her to examine a particular insect, explaining which beetles helped the garden by eating aphids and which ones caused harm by devouring roots. He turned every observation into a small lesson, but there was nothing condescending about his manner. He treated Sophie like an intelligent person capable of understanding complex ideas, and Sophie responded by asking thoughtful questions and paying close attention to his answers. Eleanor made inquiries through her personal assistant, a woman who had worked for the Ashford family for over 20 years and knew how to conduct discreet research. Within 2 days, Eleanor had a comprehensive file on Marcus Cole. The information surprised her profoundly. 4 years earlier, Marcus had been named Teacher of the Year for the entire state of Connecticut. He had taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Bridgeport, one of the most challenging districts in the state. Despite limited resources and oversized classrooms, His students consistently outperformed their peers on standardized tests. More importantly, former students and their parents described him in glowing terms. He was the teacher who stayed late to help struggling readers, who bought school supplies with his own money for families who could not afford them, who remembered every child's birthday and made each one feel special. Then, his wife Lily was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She was 34 years old, a kindergarten teacher at a neighboring school, the love of Marcus's life since they met in college. She fought the disease for 18 months with courage that inspired everyone who knew her, enduring chemotherapy and radiation and experimental treatments that left her exhausted but never defeated. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in spring, with Marcus and 3-year-old Noah holding her hands. After Lily's death, Marcus found that he could not maintain the demanding schedule that teaching required. The early mornings spent preparing lesson plans, the late nights grading papers and writing reports, the parent conferences and staff meetings and professional development workshops, none of it allowed him the flexibility he needed to raise Noah on his own without relying entirely on babysitters and daycare centers. He wanted to be present for his son in a way that his career no longer permitted. So Marcus resigned from teaching, despite offers from the district to reduce his workload, despite a community that rallied around him and begged him to stay. He took a job as a janitor and groundskeeper for a property management company that serviced wealthy neighborhoods in Fairfield County. The pay was modest compared to his teaching salary, but the hours were predictable and flexible. He could drop Noah at school every morning and pick him up every afternoon. He could attend school plays and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. He could be there when Noah had nightmares about his mother, which happened often in those first terrible years. He chose presence over prestige, fatherhood over career advancement. Eleanor watched Marcus teach Sophie how to identify a ladybug by counting its spots. She heard Sophie ask if he missed his wife, and she heard Marcus answer with raw honesty that must have cost him something to speak aloud. "Every single day," he said. "Some days are harder than others, but I believe Lily wants me and Noah to live fully. She wouldn't want us stuck in sadness. She would want us to find joy wherever we can, to help people when we have the chance, to be kind even when it's difficult." Eleanor picked up her phone and called Victoria. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that made Victoria immediately excuse herself from a meeting. "About the gardener your daughter keeps mentioning." That evening, Noah asked his father if Sophie could come to their apartment to play. Marcus hesitated, acutely aware of the invisible boundary between servants and employers, the unspoken rules that governed his position in the Ashford household. He was staff, not family, not friend, and he worried about the complications that might arise from blurring those lines. But Noah's eyes were so hopeful, and Sophie had become his closest friend, and Marcus could not bring himself to say no to either of them. To his surprise, Victoria consented to the request, though her voice on the phone was stiff and uncertain, as if she was not entirely sure why she was agreeing. She sent Sophie in a chauffeured black SUV that looked absurdly large as it pulled up to the modest apartment complex where Marcus and Noah lived. The building was clean but simple, 3 stories of red brick with iron railings on the small balconies, nothing like the gleaming mansion Sophie called home. Sophie climbed out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, studying the building with curious eyes. Inside, the apartment was small. There was no giant television dominating the living room, no expensive toys scattered across the floor, no evidence of the wealth that surrounded Sophie every day of her life. But the walls were covered with Noah's drawings, colorful scenes of dinosaurs battling robots, spaceships exploring distant planets, and stick-figure families holding hands beneath bright yellow suns. Bookshelves lined every available surface, stuffed with worn paperbacks and dog-eared picture books and novels with cracked spines from multiple readings. Sophie walked through the apartment slowly, taking in every detail. She paused at a photograph on the bookshelf showing Marcus and a beautiful woman with kind eyes, holding a baby between them. "That's my mom," Noah said quietly, appearing beside her. "She's in heaven now." Sophie turned to Marcus, who was standing in the kitchen doorway watching them. "Your house is so warm," she said finally. Marcus looked confused, glancing at the old radiator that barely kept up with the autumn chill. But Sophie was not talking about temperature. She was talking about something far more valuable, something her enormous mansion had been missing for 4 long years. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Victoria had scheduled a meeting with several business associates to discuss a new mixed-use development project in downtown Stamford. Jonathan Prescott was among the attendees, along with 4 other executives representing various investment groups and construction companies. They gathered on the stone patio in front of the mansion shortly after 9 o'clock, coffee cups from the catering service in hand, discussing zoning regulations and projected returns on investment, while the autumn sun warmed their backs. Victoria had asked Sophie to come downstairs and greet the guests before their meeting moved to the formal conference room. It was part of her careful strategy, her methodical plan to acclimate her daughter to Jonathan's presence in environments that felt natural rather than forced. If Sophie could see Jonathan as a regular fixture in their lives, perhaps the transition would be smoother when Victoria eventually revealed her intentions. Sophie appeared on the patio in a black dress that matched her mother's outfit, her long brown hair brushed smooth and shining in the morning light. She stood beside Victoria, silent and watchful, her face carefully neutral as the adults talked over her head about things she did not understand and did not care about. She had learned that adults at these gatherings rarely noticed children unless children made themselves noticed, and Sophie had no desire to draw attention. Jonathan spotted an opportunity to demonstrate his suitability as a potential stepfather. He stepped forward from the group, crouching slightly to approximate Sophie's eye level, though he did not quite manage it. His smile was wide and practiced, his voice pitched in the exaggerated tone some adults used with children, as if they were speaking to puppies rather than people. "Sophie, you look so pretty today," he said, "like a little princess. Would you like me to be your new daddy? I could buy you anything you want, toys, clothes, your own pony, whatever your heart desires." He spread his arms wide as if offering her the world on a silver platter. The other executives smiled approvingly at this display of paternal warmth. Sophie did not respond to Jonathan. Her gaze had shifted to the far edge of the driveway, where a familiar figure was pushing a cleaning cart toward the service entrance at the side of the house. Marcus Cole was dressed in his usual blue overalls and yellow rubber gloves, his face glistening with sweat from the morning's work. He moved with quiet efficiency, trying to complete his tasks without disturbing the important meeting happening on the patio. In that moment, everything crystallized for Sophie with the clarity that sometimes comes to children who have not yet learned to ignore the truth in favor of convenience. She remembered Jonathan checking his watch 11 times during lunch. She remembered the flash of irritation when she spilled lemonade on his expensive pants. She remembered the way he said, "That's nice," without ever looking at her roses. She remembered how his eyes always drifted to his phone, how his attention was always somewhere else, how he never seemed to actually see her when he looked in her direction. And then she remembered Marcus. Marcus sitting beside her in silence when she needed to cry. Marcus teaching her to plant roses and explaining why the roots needed room to breathe. Marcus letting her sob against his shoulder without trying to rush her through her grief. Marcus telling her that her father was still watching her from somewhere, that the people we love never truly leave us. Marcus, who had never once looked at his watch when they were talking, who made her feel like she was the most important person in the world. Sophie raised her hand and pointed directly at Marcus, her small finger steady and certain. "I want him to be my daddy," she declared, her voice carrying across the patio with startling clarity. The executives exchanged bewildered glances. Jonathan's smile curdled into something ugly before he managed to smooth his expression back to neutral. "This child clearly needs professional help," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Victoria grabbed Sophie's arm, perhaps more roughly than she intended, and pulled her toward the house, apologizing profusely to the assembled businessmen, her face burning with humiliation. Marcus stood frozen beside his cleaning cart, staring at the yellow rubber gloves on his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He had not asked for this. He had never intended to become anything more than a friendly presence in Sophie's life, someone who treated her with basic human kindness because that was simply who he was. Now, caught in the spotlight of the child's declaration, he did not know what to do. He bent his head and continued pushing his cart toward the service entrance, but his hands were trembling. Inside the mansion, Victoria's composure cracked. She knelt in front of Sophie, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. "Why would you say that? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? You made Mommy look foolish in front of very important people." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she did not apologize. "Because Mr. Marcus sees me," she said. "Mr. Jonathan only sees his watch." The words hit Victoria like a slap. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. She thought back to every interaction she had witnessed between Jonathan and Sophie. The distracted responses, the performative gifts, the barely concealed impatience. Sophie had seen through it all with the clarity that only children possess. That night, after Sophie was in bed, Victoria sat at her computer and began researching Jonathan Prescott with the thoroughness she applied to business acquisitions. What she found made her stomach turn. Jonathan had a daughter from his first marriage, a 14-year-old named Megan who lived with her mother in California. Court records showed that Jonathan had fought aggressively for minimal custody during the divorce, citing his busy schedule. Financial records revealed that he communicated with Megan exclusively through his attorney, sending monthly support payments, but nothing else. He had not spoken directly to his own daughter in 18 months. Victoria called Jonathan the next morning, her voice cold and controlled. She confronted him about Megan, about his absence from his daughter's life. Jonathan's response was dismissive. "She chose to live with her mother," he said. "I respect her decision. Children need space to grow." The callousness in his voice chilled Victoria to her core. She was looking at a man who had abandoned his own flesh and blood because parenting was inconvenient. She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about her own mother, about the morning she woke up to find her gone, about the years of loneliness that followed. She had almost handed Sophie to a man who would repeat that same abandonment. Her 7-year-old daughter had seen the truth that Victoria's fear had blinded her to. The following afternoon, Marcus appeared at the service entrance of the mansion, asking to speak with Victoria. He was clutching his cap in his hands, his expression anxious. He apologized for whatever role he might have played in Sophie's outburst. He assured Victoria that he had never encouraged such familiarity, that he understood his place, that he would keep his distance from now on. Victoria listened in silence, her arms crossed. When Marcus finished, she spoke in a voice that was more tired than angry. "Stay away from my daughter," she said. Marcus nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "Sophie is a remarkable child. All she needs is for the adults in her life to actually listen to her." He walked out. Victoria stood alone in the foyer, his words echoing in her mind long after he was gone. Victoria forbade Sophie from visiting the garden while Marcus was working, but she found herself watching him from the window. She observed him arriving before dawn, completing his tasks with quiet efficiency, always finishing before the household stirred so he would not disturb anyone. She watched him tend the flower beds with care that seemed excessive for hired help, as if the garden were his own. One afternoon, she saw Noah running across the lawn toward his father. Marcus set down his tools and lifted the boy into the air, spinning him around, both of them laughing despite Marcus's sweat-stained clothes and dirt-covered hands. Victoria tried to remember the last time she had held Sophie like that. The last time they had laughed together with such abandon. She could not. Eleanor arrived unannounced that evening, finding Victoria sitting alone in the darkened living room. The older woman settled into a chair across from her daughter-in-law and spoke with the directness that age had earned her. "You're trying to protect Sophie," Eleanor said. I understand that, but what exactly are you protecting her from? A man who genuinely cares about her? Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed everything. The diagnosis, the fear, the desperate attempt to secure Sophie's future through a loveless arrangement. Eleanor moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around Victoria's shoulders. Sophie doesn't need a perfect resume, Eleanor said softly. She needs someone who will see her. And it seems she's already found that person. After Eleanor left, Victoria walked upstairs to Sophie's room. The little girl was sitting on her bed, drawing in a sketchbook. Victoria looked at the picture, taking shape on the page. It showed a small house with 4 figures standing in front, 2 adults and 2 children. The figures were holding hands. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry I yelled at you," she said. "Can you tell me more about Mr. Marcus?" Sophie's face transformed with hope. She began talking rapidly, describing how Marcus taught her about plants and insects, how he listened without interrupting, how he talked about his wife Lily without pretending the sadness did not exist. "He never looks at his watch when he's with me, Mommy," Sophie said. "Not even once." Victoria realized that her daughter had found something precious, something Victoria herself had been seeking through all the wrong means. Sophie had found someone who made her feel valued simply for who she was. Victoria summoned Marcus to her private office the next morning. He arrived expecting to be fired, his jaw set with resignation. Instead, Victoria gestured to a chair and asked him to sit. "I owe you an apology," she began, "and I owe you an explanation." She told Marcus about the diagnosis, about her fear of leaving Sophie alone, about the misguided plan to find a suitable stepfather through logic and spreadsheets. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, Victoria asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why have you been so kind to my daughter?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I see my son in her eyes," he said finally. "That same loneliness, that same need for someone to just be present. I didn't mean to overstep. I just couldn't walk past a child in pain." Victoria nodded slowly. "I know you used to be a teacher," she said. "State Teacher of the Year. Why did you give that up to become a janitor?" Marcus told her about Lily, about the diagnosis that came out of nowhere, about the 18 months of hope and despair that followed. After she died, he could not maintain the demanding schedule that teaching required. Noah needed him in ways that did not fit into lesson plans and staff meetings, so he found work that let him be available. "I could go back to teaching," Marcus said. "I could have more prestige, more income. But I chose to be there for my son every single day. That's worth more than any title." Something shifted in Victoria's chest. She thought about her own choices, the endless meetings and conference calls that pulled her away from Sophie, the hired caregivers who filled the gaps she left behind. Sophie had asked her once why she never sat down to talk like Mr. Marcus did. Victoria had not had an answer. "Would you and Noah stay for dinner tonight?" Victoria asked. "Not as an employee. As a guest." The meal took place not in the formal dining room with its crystal chandeliers and 18-seat table, but in the cozy breakfast nook off the kitchen. Victoria, Sophie, Marcus, and Noah sat together, passing dishes of roasted chicken and vegetables. The children dominated the conversation, interrupting each other with stories about school and drawings and the caterpillar they had found in the garden. Marcus helped Victoria clear the plates afterward, their shoulders nearly touching as they worked side by side at the sink. Victoria paused, a dish in her hand, listening to Sophie and Noah's laughter from the other room. "This is what a family sounds like," she said quietly. "I'd forgotten." 3 months later, Victoria emerged from surgery with a clean bill of health. The growth had been successfully removed, and the doctors expressed confidence in her full recovery. During her time in the hospital, Marcus had brought Sophie to visit every single day, sitting with the little girl in the waiting room during procedures, bringing her favorite books to read aloud. Victoria and Marcus began spending time together outside the boundaries of employer and employee. They took things slowly, both carrying wounds that required careful handling. Marcus did not move into the mansion. Instead, he invited Victoria and Sophie to his small apartment once a week for homemade dinners, wanting Sophie to understand that love had nothing to do with square footage or price tags. One autumn afternoon, Marcus drove Victoria to a cemetery on the outskirts of Bridgeport. They walked together to a modest headstone engraved with the name Lily Marie Cole. Marcus knelt to place fresh flowers beneath the marker. "I wanted you to know about her," he said, "and I wanted her to know about you." Victoria crouched beside him, laying her own small bouquet next to his. "Thank you for loving him," she said softly to the stone. "I promise I will treasure what you built together." Noah began calling Victoria Miss Vic, a name he invented himself. Sophie continued calling Marcus Mr. Marcus, explaining to her mother that she was not ready to say Dad because her real father still lived in her heart. Marcus understood completely. "I'll be here no matter what you call me," he told her. "That's not going to change." 1 year after Sophie first pointed at the man in yellow gloves, Victoria hosted a board meeting at the mansion. The executives gathered in the formal living room, Jonathan Prescott among them. Through the window, they could see Marcus playing with Sophie and Noah on the lawn, all three of them laughing as they kicked a soccer ball back and forth. Jonathan watched with barely concealed disdain. "I see you still have the gardener around," he remarked. Victoria turned to face him, her expression serene. "He's my fiancé," she said. The room went silent. Jonathan's face cycled through shock, confusion, and something close to disgust. Victoria continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "My daughter taught me something important last year. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured by whether a person stops what they're doing to listen when a child is crying." That evening, after the guests had gone, Marcus led Victoria to the garden. He guided her to the rose bushes that he and Sophie had planted together nearly 2 years earlier. The plants had grown tall and strong, covered in blooms that caught the dying light. Sophie and Noah appeared from behind a hedge, each carrying a small velvet box. Marcus dropped to one knee. "I never expected this," he said, looking up at Victoria. "I never expected any of this, but Sophie saw something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself. And you trusted her enough to look." Victoria was crying before he even finished asking the question. She said yes through her tears, and Sophie and Noah tackled them both in a tangle of arms and laughter. Later, as the stars emerged over Greenwich, Sophie pulled Marcus aside. She looked up at the man who had changed everything simply by being kind. "I knew Mommy would see what I saw," she said. "I just had to wait for her to look." Marcus kissed her forehead gently. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. Sophie hugged him tightly, her voice muffled against his chest. "You were the only one who didn't look at your watch. Sometimes the clearest eyes belong to the youngest observers." Sophie Ashford did not choose a father for herself that morning on the patio. She simply pointed her mother toward a truth that had been standing in plain sight all along. Wearing blue overalls and yellow gloves, patient enough to sit beside a crying child and wait for her to be ready to speak. And in that single gesture, she gave her mother something no amount of money could buy. She gave her the chance to build a family not from spreadsheets and strategy, but from presence, patience, and love.